I was just talking to Patrick that the guidance from the bishop for speakers is that when you're speaking extemporaneously, you don't have to wear your mask. And for the sake of all of our hearing, it might be better for you to be able to see our lips. I hope that all are okay with that. I want to welcome all of you to Calvary Episcopal Church. I want to welcome Patrick and Susan Dean, my dear friends here. But before I get into any more about our author and let him read, I hope that you would join me in a prayer that seems very appropriate for today in the subject. It's in our Book of Common Prayer. It's for the beauty of the earth. And so there are enough Episcopalians in here so you know how to respond when I invite you in to pray. But if you'd like, you may stand. If you would rather sit, that's fine as well. The Lord be with you. Amen. We give you thanks, most gracious God, for the beauty of earth and sky and sea, for the richness of mountains, plains, and rivers, for the songs of birds and the loveliness of flowers. We praise you for these good gifts and pray that we may safeguard them for our posterity. Grant that we may continue to grow in our grateful enjoyment of your abundant creation to the honor and glory of your name, now and forever. Amen. So privileged to have Patrick Dean here with us tonight. Patrick is a son of the Delta, a homeboy, if you will, of the Mississippi Delta. You may have read some of his biographical information. His father, Edwin, taught here for 6-7 years, is that right? Mathematics?
5 years.
5 years, mathematics, and spent time growing up here in Cleveland and also in Leland. If some of you who've read the book, you may have some questions that might prompt him to reflect on his biography in his life experience. So I'm going to be relatively brief and try to bring some of that out in the discussion that we're about to have. But I will say that Patrick and I have known each other for some time now. When I was in seminary, my wife and his wife, Susan, were office mates at Tracy City Elementary School. And it was then that he started telling me about his master's thesis on Hudson Stuck, this amazing, adventurous, heroic, courageous Episcopal priest whose circuit was the Yukon in Alaska. And I was fascinated by it then and riveted by this wonderful tale that you have spellbindingly woven, as one of your reviews said. So without further ado, let's welcome Patrick Dean.
Thank you, Les. It's great to be here. It's this morning I was on Google and I went to Fifth Avenue and I looked at 403 Fifth Avenue where I consider myself to have grown up, and I took myself down Fifth Avenue looking at the houses on either side and remembering what it was like to walk to campus from my house and to walk to basketball games, and there was a little place, was it called the Varsity, I think? Pinball machines, the Varsity, and the corner market right there on Court Street and Fifth Avenue where I used to get the big long things of great bubble gum. It's not here anymore, obviously, but there was an ancient gym over by where the old natatorium used to be that probably was built in the 1920s, but I was a gym rat and played basketball in that gym just all the time. So it's great to be back. It's great to see the town where I grew up and see people who were here and see Andy Jones, who was my neighbor, and all that. So it's just really, really great to be here. Do you want me to start with a reading first?
Yes, please. Yes,
okay.
Please.
All right. Enough of that sentimental nostalgia stuff. Here we go. I'm going to, the beginning, the first 4 pages of the prologue, I think really sort of sets the stage for everything I'm trying to talk about with Hudson Stuck. So Why don't I do that? Hudson Stuck could barely breathe. A tough and experienced outdoorsman who had spent the last decade dog sledding and tramping across Alaska and the Yukon, Stuck nevertheless gasped in the high, thin air 20,000 feet above sea level. He and his 3 companions stood just below the summit ridge of Denali, the highest peak in North America, on a clear, windy, 4-degree below zero day. Stuck wore 6 pairs of socks inside his leather moccasins with iron ice creepers or crampons attached to the bottom. Immense lynx fur-lined mitts covered inner Scotch wool gloves, and his torso was layered beneath a fur-hooded Alaskan parka. Yet, Stuck wrote, until high noon, feet were like lumps of iron. Behind them stretched what Stuck called the dim blue lowlands of the future Denali National Park, with threads of stream and patches of lake that still carry ice along their banks. A few smaller peaks squatted off to the northeast. In every other direction, the immensity of the mountain they perched on blocked their views of Mount Foraker and the other peaks in the Alaska Range. Above them, just a few hundred more yards of climbing, and the prize, to be the first humans to set foot atop Denali, would be theirs. It was June 7, 1913. They were Stuck, Episcopal Archdeacon of Alaska and the Yukon, the oldest of the group at nearly 50 years old, short and wiry, his neatly trimmed beard the only one among the 4. Walter Harper, the youngest at age 20, half Alaskan native, fit and confident. Harry Karstens, 34, calmly competent from his years in the Alaskan backcountry. Excuse me. And Robert Tatum, 21, the greenest member of the team. They had launched this expedition 8 weeks earlier, enduring bitter cold, severe altitude, and the loss of key supplies to a campfire. The team had arrived at their last camp just below 18,000 feet the night before. Awakening to a brilliant, bitterly cold morning, the party had reached the summit slope after 8 grueling hours with Harper in the lead. Surrounded by nothing but snow and ice, their toes and fingers numb, they approached the final ridge to the summit. Though all the men were unable to fully take in air, it was curious to see every man's mouth open for breathing, Stuck later write. It was hardest for him. Everything kept turning black for Stuck as he choked and gasped, almost unable to get any breath at all. The missionary's load had already been reduced. The other members had divided up the contents of his pack, leaving him only the bulky mercurial barometer he had stubbornly carried up the mountain to make scientific observations on the summit. Now he struggled even under the barometer's weight. Finally, Harper, the youngest and strongest member of the expedition on this day, doubled back to where Stuck knelt in the snow, took the barometer, and hoisted it onto his back. Harper's presence on the mountain was important to Stuck for more than just his youthful vigor and physical strength. Since coming to Alaska in 1904 to become Archdeacon of Alaska and the Yukon, Stuck had become a fervent champion of the rights of the native people. In the Alaska of this era, a raucous and deeply unsettled meeting point between traditional native ways and the modern white culture, was a center of feverish trade and feverish vice, in Stuck's words. Stuck spent most of his time ministering to the Athabascan peoples in his region. He bore no illusions that their lives would be improved by the onslaught of Western ways. Harper, who was half Athabascan and half Irish, represented Stuck's aspirations for the natives of the far north. Walter's father, Arthur Harper, a distant figure in his life, was a pioneer in the history of white Alaska, the first to imagine gold in the Yukon, where he met Walter's mother. Walter was raised by his mother in an Athabascan village, and at 16 met Stuck at the mission school in Tanana. They forged a lifelong connection. On Denali, in Stuck's words, Harper ran Karstens close in strength, pluck, and endurance. Robert Tatum was a Tennessean who had come to Alaska to study for holy orders in the Episcopal Church. He had proved himself the previous winter by joining a heroic relief effort, helping deliver by dog sled desperately needed supplies to 2 women missionaries down the dangerous ice of the frozen Tanana River. His experience with surveying tools and other scientific instruments, and his willingness to serve as a cook for the expedition, along with what Stuck termed his consistent courtesy and considerateness, made Tatum a very pleasant comrade. Harry Karstens had been in Alaska for almost 2 decades, and learned its often harsh lessons firsthand. He had earned the right to be considered a sourdough, a term derived from prospectors' habit of carrying a starter of sourdough bread in a pouch around their neck, later expanded to describe those who'd been in the far north long enough to prove themselves. He had made his reputation in the backcountry since the Klondike Gold Rush of 1897, making his reputation on the mail routes, prospector streams, and hunting expeditions of early 1900s Alaska. Stuck explicitly relied on Karstens for his outdoor skills and experience, as well as his toughness. Karstens, on the other hand, had less sympathy than Harper for Stuck's difficulties. To Karstens, a hardened miner and backwoodsman, Stuck's insistence on spending time with the books and writing materials he brought to Denali, not to mention the burden that carrying such extra weight imposed on everyone, amounted to little more than, quote, lying in the tent, unquote. Karstens' antagonism toward Stuck, which increased with each step up the mountain, was fated to flare to far worse. For his part, Stuck had always admired Karstens, describing him as strong, confident, and resourceful, the true leader of the expedition in the face of difficulty and danger. He would never understand his former partner's antagonism in the wake of the expedition's success and fame. But for now, Stuck and the others had to put all animosities aside and focus on putting one foot in front of the other, slowly and deliberately gasping and grasping for the summit.
So I'm going to ask a few questions that I'm dying to ask Patrick, and then we'll open it up for you all that have read it or would like to know more about the process of this after we've had a couple of minutes to chat. But you tell a very interesting story about when you first met Hudson Stuck, and I wonder if you might sort of elaborate on that story and sort of get us from that point in that dusty place where you found the volume that you found, and then to your thought. It's because it's been a long process.
Right. Well, you can go back even farther than I think you're talking about, because in my family, reading Lanterns on the Levee is like just part of the canon. It's what you do when you grow up in the Mississippi Delta. You read Lanterns on the Levee, and in the famous Swanee chapter by William Alexander Percy, when he's describing Arcadia and all that kind of stuff in Swanee, Tennessee, he has this part where he's talking about the Swanee type, like the kinds of people who populated Arcadia, and he describes Hudson Stuck in there. He doesn't name him, but he said one of us summited the highest mountain in North America, a lone Indian boy by his side, which was not true, as you could tell from what I just read, but it was typical melodramatic Will Percy, right? So sometime in my teenage years, I read Lanterns on the Levee, and that's how even though I didn't know it, that was when I first made the acquaintance of Archdeacon Stuck. In 1984, I was lucky enough to work at Lemuria Bookstore for a year in Jackson, and I had a discount. So I snapped up books all the time, just all the time, compulsively. And I was very much into Africa and Alaska, these two places that just seized my imagination. And one of the books I grabbed was 10,000 Miles with a Dog Sled by Hudson Stuck, dedicated to Swanee, although I'm not sure I noticed it at that point. And I still have that copy of that book that I got so many years ago and used it in writing this. So, and then in 1999, Susan and I moved to the mountain, to Swanee Mountain, and we started going to All Saints Chapel in Swanee. And in the chapel, there's a plaque from his fraternity brothers. All Saints is one of those English-style chapels with plaques memorializing professors and important people in Swanee, and there was one for Hudson Stuck there. And also in the back, behind the altar, one of the statues in the reredos with all the saints and everybody, there's a guy dressed in Arctic stuff with a dog sled jumping up on him, and it's Hudson Stuck, it's a statue. So at some point, I put all this together, and oh, that's the guy, and that's the guy, and that's the guy. And then I started getting a master's in theology at the university itself. And at some point I decided he was who I should do my thesis on. So that was that. And then in the way of things, I became Swanee's hometown resident expert on Hudson Stuck. Anytime anybody wanted a lecture or something, So I started talking about him to groups and things like that in Swanee. And then eventually it led to the idea of a book. And here we are.
So one of the things that struck me very early on about Hudson Stuck, and I'm going to try to do this in a way that does not give away too much, but as a priest, it checked that box for me. And as an adventurer, it checked that box for me. And in both regards, I felt like less of a priest and much less of an adventurer for having read his story. Because much of this book, it's not just an adventure narrative about his time on Denali. To me, that figures in it prominently, obviously, as something that frames a narrative about a real tenacious spirit, both in the service of doing great things and courageous things, but also in the service of the social gospel. And his activism was absolutely enviable for a priest. Would you highlight a few of the ways that Hudson Stuck embodied as an activist, and then maybe correlated with some of his adventure spirit, in your own words, maybe?
Sure. I mean, that's definitely a major part of his life, and a major thing that you can point to as accomplishments of his. And he would have preferred it. I mean, he would definitely have preferred that. He would rather have been known for those accomplishments, such as the ones I'm going to mention a couple of, than being the first to summit Denali. When he became the Dean of St. Matthew's Cathedral in Dallas in the early 1900s, one of the first things he did when he got there was he established a boys' school, St. Matthew's School for Boys, a home for aged women, a night school for mill workers, and in 1902 he was one of the leaders in the city or in the state actually, to get the state's first child labor laws passed. And that's in the space of 10 years he did all that. And then when he moved to Alaska, St. Matthew's in Fairbanks was unfinished, moribund, just going nowhere. The church that was supposed to be the Episcopal church, and literally within a month, the doors were open and they were having services at St. Matthew's. He was just a whirlwind, just a dynamo. He built reading rooms for, there was no place to go for men in Alaska except saloons. And so what he did was he created a reading room within St. Matthew's Church in Fairbanks so that they would have some place to go. He got churches down in the lower 48 to send magazines and books and a phonograph player. So they would have reading material and things to listen to. He built the first hospital north of the Arctic Circle. He traveled, when you were talking about feeling a little bit less of a priest because of stuff. He went to all his mission churches in the dead of winter by dog sled. Every year, pretty much, for 10 years. 50 below and all that. So he definitely had that social gospel, that muscular Christianity in the very fiber of his being.
So I walked to someone's house today to bring them communion. And I was thinking about the dog sledding as I was doing it on a beautiful spring day in very flat terrain. So he mentioned the term muscular Christian, and I doubt that all of us are familiar with that term. And it's a fascinating sort of epic in the church. Can you just define that for us and tell us a little bit about it and some of the ambivalence that maybe Stuck had for it in regards to him?
Yeah, so in the late 19th century, first in England or Britain and then in America, you had this movement called muscular Christianity, and it was a reaction toward there was a sense in the church, or part of the church, that it was too soft, too meek, too mild of a religion. Perhaps because of the Industrial Revolution and what was happening, but in sort of reaction to that, you had this very sort of vigorous, the same sort of ideas that propelled missionaries to Africa to to spread the gospel and be strong and all that sort of thing. And so this muscular Christianity relied on about grit and determination and hardiness and all that sort of thing, and Stuck to a large degree represented that. I mean, we can tell from his life story that he did have those sorts of things. But there was also a less desirable side to that movement, as you can imagine. It tended to bleed over into sort of a condescending, imperialistic, colonialistic sort of attitude toward the people who were being served. And Stuck, to an amazing degree, seemed to not suffer from that sort of side of it. He sort of embodied the best parts of muscular Christianity. He was obviously vigorous and full of grit and determination, but he didn't seem to condescend or have any sort of savior complex about the people he worked with. It was a very, very great relationship, and I've heard wonderful tales from people who, in Alaska, people who know people who knew Stuck. It's an amazing connection to have made, and they just love him. I mean, Alaska natives love Hudson Stuck in his memory to this day. You don't do that by being a condescending sort of, white savior complex messiah type person.
Right. So you were able to travel some of in his footsteps, or no?
No, this is where the imposter syndrome happens, because I was supposed to go to Alaska last May and June, and to Austin, Texas, where the archives of the Episcopal Church are, but the pandemic prevented me from doing it. So you have in your hands a book written about a place where I've never been, and talk about imposter syndrome. But I was very lucky to meet some of the people I'm talking about virtually, on the phone, that sort of thing, like the retired rector of St. Matthew's in Fairbanks, Stuck's successor, who knew people who knew Stuck, and was a wonderful source of information. Harry Carson's grandson and great-grandson, who spent a lot of time, sent me documents, read chapters, gave me tips. And a young man named Alan Hayton, who I engaged to be my sensitivity reader, which is someone who, he's an Alaska native, and so I had him read the manuscript from an Alaska native point of view to sort of proofread me and make sure I didn't do anything intentionally mistaken or disrespectful or that sort of thing. And he's related to John Fredson, who was a 16-year-old that they left behind at base camp in Denali on the expedition of 1913. So I had some wonderful connections that helped bridge the gap and ease a little bit of the imposter syndrome about not going to Alaska.
One more question, and then I'll open it up to you. Fascinating man, lots of dimensions, and you have researched it beautifully. Your scholarship is fantastic in this, and more tedious than this aspiring fiction writer could ever. Just ask Ben King, who taught me church history, about my researching skills and footnoting skills. But as I was reading, I wondered if there was any one aspect of Hudson Stuck that still figures in your imagination as an enigma, as something. Is there one line that you of his biography that you wish you knew more about?
Yeah, I mean, this may be a little bit in the weeds, but we don't, other than the Denali expedition, there's several things that he did in terms of mountaineering that we don't know enough about for me. Like, he has this throwaway line about, he was born in London and lived in England for his first 22 years of life. And he has this throwaway line in some letter that I scrambled among the Lake District mountains as a youth. And I want to know more about that, because that's where the highest mountains in England are. It's the Lake District, it's Wordsworth and Coleridge and Shelley. But I want to know, did he actually do actual mountaineering then? Did he get to the top of the highest mountain? And, and there are other points. We know he went to the Rockies. We know he went to the Grand Canyon. We know he went summited Rainier, but that's all we know. So I'd love to know more about his background in those things before he actually went to Denali. So That's the scholar in me. I want more details about those.
Sure.
So,
I'll open it up to any of you that would like to ask Patrick a question.
yes, sir.
I think I remember from elementary school geography or something, the highest mountain in the United States was Mount McKinley. Did you misunderstand that or something?
That's a beautiful question. Did you ask that question on purpose?
Set it up for you, didn't he? Yeah. It factors into this book for
It
sure.
definitely does. So, about half a dozen years before Stuck's expedition, a prospector in Alaska had decided that that big mountain should be named Mount McKinley. But the mountain he was talking about had been called Denali by natives there for thousands of years. It's the same mountain. And when Stuck wrote his book about the expedition, which he called The Ascent of Denali, he began the forward and ended the afterward with the plea that the mountain be restored to its native name of Denali. And until 2014, it was the official name of the mountain, until during the Obama administration, the Park Service finally decided to change the name officially to Denali. So the national park has been called Denali forever. So that's the story. That's the same mountain. You were not taught incorrectly. And it's a great example of Stuck's, his way of looking at things. Because he climbed the mountain at least largely to highlight his work in Alaska and the missionary work in Alaska, and to highlight the situation with Alaska natives.
Who was McKinley?
The president. I can't remember his first name. McKinley's first name.
Don't ask me. I'm just a
William
priest.
McKinley, yes, thank you, Lord.
Blanked on something that, but yes, it was named for McKinley. So,
Other questions for Patrick?
My wife, Pat and I saw it, I think it was about 5 years ago. And I remember the reaction I had was it was just so massive that you couldn't imagine being on it. In fact, I think there was somebody like that. They looked like ant. It was just overpowering his sheer dimensions.
Right, it's just amazing. It's an amazing monstrosity of a mountain. From base to top, it's higher than Everest. Everest is the tallest overall, but there's less distance from its base, from the ground where you start, than from Denali's base to the top. So, and today when people climb Denali, they take a helicopter up to a glacier. That's about halfway up. And Stuck and his guys did it from dog sled from Tanana, weeks and weeks by dog sled to get to the base, then took dog sleds up part of the way before they sent them back down, and then went all the way up themselves. So I almost want to think, unless you do it that way.
I've got a buddy that I'll get you in touch with who's actually leading a charge of or a ascent next spring. If you want to get in on that, see if I can get you a deal. I don't think he's trained in dog sledding, but maybe avalanche safety. You know, you Sonny, you mentioned the way that figures in and triggers your imagination. Really beautiful way, I thought, of how you kept this. People who run marathons, people who see, like my son Gus back there, who see a tree and wonder if they can climb it. People who and mark achievements and things in their lives according to these sorts of things. There's a sort of a sense of constant longing, and that you do a good job of sustaining throughout this book. And it's through the words of the people who are also inspired by the behemoth mountain in the distance, and it, because Stuck himself is such a good writer. It's almost, some of his stuff is almost like a love poem to this mountain, this yearning he has to ascend this mountain. Another thing that Stuck would do, I want to say probably day in and day out. The whole ascent took close, was it over 3 months?
They left on March 17th and they ascended on June 13th, so April, May, June, 3 months plus.
And every single day, whether it was 50 degrees below or whatever, snowing, windy, they said morning prayer and evening prayer as a group. It was the whole journey for me. It was neat that it was punctuated by daily worship and prayer. It was a voyage not just of there. I don't know how much of his ego was involved in this as much as it was just to try to climb the heights of what his wherewithal would endure, and do it to the glory of God. He seemed pretty. Do you have that same opinion of Stuck?
I think that's accurate. Though let's give him a little ego.
Yeah.
Let's grant him a little bit of that. He had this massive library of exploration. He left several hundred volumes of his library to Swanee, to the university, and it's amazing to go in there and he's got Vancouver, and he's got Cook, and he's got Hakluyt from the 15th century, and he's got all of these great explorers, descriptions of what they did, and he could drop just minor points about, I really think sleds are a good thing, as so-and-so said in his 1827 book about exploring whatever, so he definitely wanted, I think, to have his place in that group, but I think basically you're right. I think he did it for all the right reasons, with a little bit of ego attached.
Sure. Any other questions?
Do you plan to eventually go to Denali in Alaska? It seems like you would have to, for sure, to see if you got it right.
I'm afraid to see if I got it right, but
or if you got it wrong.
but I do want to go. Susan says we're going, and I definitely, and Scott Fisher, my priest friend up in Fairbanks, says he's going to take me dog sledding, which I'm really looking forward to. Denali, I don't know. I've been 11,000 feet up, which is about halfway. Elsewhere in Wyoming. I don't know about the mountaineering part. I'll have to see about that.
I'll get you in touch with my buddy.
They'd be dragging, just like Stuck, they'd be dragging me up the mountain probably. I'd be gasping for breath like Stuck probably.
He's a good one. He'd do it for you. Other questions or comments? Well, do you have a takeaway, a tagline, a statement about this that you want potential readers and readers of the book to hear from its author's mouth?
Well, I was lucky enough to do a TEDx talk about Stuck at the University of the South, and I talked about 3 principles of his life that I thought were pretty important and applicable. It was about taking on risks, taking on challenges, appreciating and loving nature, and doing good for others. I think he's a wonderful example of that, and I think we can do worse than think of those 3 things for our lives. So, and one other thing, when I signed everybody's book, you may notice that I drew a little mountain with an arrow on it, and that's in the hope that people will consider climbing your own mountain, whatever it is. Not many mountains here, literally, but whatever your personal mountain is, I hope you'll think about wanting to climb it.
Thank you. Thankful that you've been inspired by Hudson Stuck. Thank you for inspiring me, and hopefully these good people here and these at home to delve more deeply into this, come away perhaps feeling like they can do those 3 things in their own little arena in this good, wonderful, beautiful earth that we live upon. Thank you, Patrick D. I've got to go turn the camera off.
Thanks, y'all. Really appreciate it. Hope you all enjoy the book.
Getting good pictures though, because I was angled behind the thing.
What?
I was angled behind the thing, so I didn't get very good pictures. I'm gonna go get my purse on 5
Oh, awesome. Okay.
I enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
My friend, my oldest friend here, Ned Mitchell, good Episcopal. He's real shy. He wanted me to